He forged my name on a document that changed my entire life, and he did it while I was sitting in a hospital waiting room, praying he would survive. I want you to think about that for a second. I was holding a paper cup of cold coffee, watching the clock on that waiting room wall, asking God to save my brother's life, and at that exact moment, he was already planning how to take everything from me. My name is Claire. I'm 31 years old now. I own a small bookkeeping business that I built from nothing. I have a rescue dog named Biscuit who sleeps at the foot of my bed, and I live in a house that I bought with my own money in Columbus, Ohio. My life is steady and quiet and mine, but none of that came easy, and none of it came without first losing almost everything. Let me take you back to the beginning. My mother died when I was 22 years old. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by October, 7 months. That's all we got from diagnosis to funeral. She was 54 years old, and she still had reading glasses with little daisies on the frames, and she still called me every Sunday morning just to chat, and then one October afternoon she was just gone. My mother wasn't a wealthy woman. She worked 30 years as a school librarian in Dayton, Ohio. She drove a used Honda, she clipped coupons. But she was careful with money in a way that most people aren't, and when she died, she left behind 2 things that mattered. The first was a life insurance policy worth $90,000. The second was my brother, Marcus. Marcus is 4 years older than me. Growing up, he was the one my father called the smart one, the driven one, the one who was going places. I was the quiet one, the reader, the one who stayed out of trouble by staying mostly invisible. Marcus was loud and charming and funny, and everyone loved him immediately, including my mother, who I think loved both of us equally but showed it differently depending on the day. When my mother got sick, Marcus came back from Chicago, where he'd been living since his mid-20s. He came back and he was attentive and helpful, and he cooked for her and drove her to appointments, and I remember thinking, this is the version of my brother I always hoped existed. Maybe grief was going to make us closer. Maybe losing her was going to give us back each other. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about almost everything that year. My mother's will was straightforward. The $90,000 life insurance payout was to be split equally between me and Marcus, $45,000 each. She also had a small savings account, maybe $8,000, that she left to a cousin who had helped her during her first round of chemo. Everything else, the furniture and books and her daisy glasses and her Honda, was to be divided between the 2 of us however we saw fit. It seemed simple. It seemed handled. I was 22 and grieving, and I trusted my brother completely. Here is what I didn't know. 2 weeks before my mother died, while she was on heavy pain medication and barely lucid, Marcus had gone to a notary with a document he'd drafted himself. It wasn't the official will. It was a separate letter, handwritten, that claimed my mother wanted the entirety of her life insurance payout to go to Marcus alone because, and I am not making this up, because I had, according to this letter, expressed no interest in the money and encouraged her to leave it to him. I never said that. I never said anything remotely like that. I was 22 years old and my mother was dying, and the last thing I was thinking about was the insurance money. But Marcus had found a notary. He had a signature. And the signature looked enough like my mother's that nobody questioned it immediately. I didn't find out for almost 3 years. In the weeks after the funeral, Marcus told me there had been a complication with the insurance payout. He said the company had flagged something, some kind of review process, and that it would take longer than expected. He said he was handling it. He said I shouldn't worry. I was 22 and devastated and exhausted, and I believed him. I went back to my apartment in Columbus. I went back to my entry-level accounting job. I called him on his birthday and at Christmas, and he always answered and was always warm, and I had no reason to think anything was wrong. That first year, I didn't ask about the money. It felt crass to push it. My mother was gone, and the money didn't feel real yet. The second year, I asked once, gently, and Marcus said it was still being sorted out, that insurance companies were a nightmare, that he was working with a lawyer. He sounded frustrated on my behalf. He sounded like a devoted older brother working hard to fix an unjust situation. The third year, I asked again, and something in his voice was different. There was a pause that was half a second too long. Then he said, "Claire, I've been meaning to talk to you about that." He flew to Columbus the following weekend. He took me to dinner at a restaurant I couldn't really afford, which should have been my first sign, and over pasta he explained that the insurance company had ultimately sided with the letter, my mother's letter, the one that said she wanted him to have everything. He said he'd tried to fight it on my behalf, but there was nothing he could do. He said he was sorry. He said he felt terrible. He looked me in the eyes and said he was sorry, and I believed him, and I drove home and sat on my kitchen floor and cried until I couldn't anymore. I told myself it was okay. My mother had loved him, and maybe she had changed her mind, and maybe she hadn't told me because she didn't want to hurt me. I made up a story that let me keep my brother and let me keep the peace and let me keep breathing, and I moved on. I moved on for 2 more years. And then my aunt called me. My aunt is my mother's younger sister. Her name is Ruth Ann, and she lives in Dayton, and she is 71 years old, and she has white hair and sharp eyes, and she has never in her life said a word she didn't mean. She called me on a Wednesday evening in January, and she said, "Claire, I need you to come to Dayton. I need to show you something I found." I drove to Dayton on a Saturday morning. Ruth Ann met me at the door of her small house, and she brought me inside and she put a folder on her kitchen table without saying anything. Inside the folder was a photocopy of the letter Marcus had presented to the insurance company. Ruth Ann had requested it through her own channels. She'd been friendly with my mother's attorney and had asked questions nobody else thought to ask. I read the letter twice. And then I read the signature. I had grown up watching my mother sign her name. I had seen it on permission slips and birthday cards and checks and Christmas tags for 30 years. Her name was Diane, and she looped the D in a particular way, and she always underlined the whole thing slightly, just a habit she'd had since college. The signature on that letter had the loop. It had the underline. But the pressure was wrong. The D leaned slightly right in a way my mother's never did. "That's not her signature," I said. Ruth Ann said, "No, it's not." I sat at her kitchen table for a long time. Ruth Ann made coffee and put a plate of cookies in front of me that I didn't touch. Outside her window, the January sky was white and flat. "How long have you known?" I asked. "I suspected for a while," she said, "but I didn't have proof. And I didn't want to tell you something that would destroy your relationship with your brother if I was wrong." I drove home in a kind of silence that had a sound to it, like pressure in your ears. That night, I could not sleep. I lay on my side in the dark, and I went through every conversation I'd had with Marcus in the last 5 years. Every holiday, every phone call, every time he'd said he was sorry and looked me in the eyes. I thought about all the Sunday mornings my mother had called me just to chat, and I thought about the way she'd looked at both of us in her last weeks, like she was trying to memorize us, and I thought about how she had worked 30 years as a librarian and clipped coupons and carefully saved so that she could leave us each $45,000. And I thought about how Marcus had taken all of it. $90,000. My mother's entire life insurance policy gone. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in those weeks. People expect these stories to be about rage, and there was rage, yes, but what surprised me was how much of it was just grief. Clean, specific grief. Because losing the money was one thing, but realizing my brother had sat across from me at dinner and looked me in the eyes and lied, that was something I had to grieve all over again, separately, like losing a second person. I didn't call Marcus. I knew that if I called him, I would either say too much or say nothing, and either way, I would lose the advantage. I had spent 5 years being the little sister who didn't push, who gave the benefit of the doubt, who believed the charitable explanation. I wasn't going to be that person anymore. I called a lawyer instead. Her name was Otsis, and she had an office downtown, and she wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she did not waste words. I brought her the photocopy Ruth Ann had given me. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Do you have any samples of your mother's authentic signature?" I had birthday cards. I had Christmas cards. I had an old check from 2015 that I'd kept in a box of my mother's things for no reason I could explain. I had her library card, which she'd never gotten around to canceling, with her signature on the back. I had more than I realized. Patricia said, "This is going to take time, but I think you have a case." The document examination took 6 weeks. The forensic document examiner was a woman named Dr. Sandra Reeves, who had testified in federal cases and who explained her findings to me in a room that smelled like printer ink and old carpet. She pointed at the signature under magnification. She showed me the pressure differential, the micro tremors that appear in authentic signatures from a 73-year-old woman on pain medication versus the smooth strokes of someone copying deliberately. She showed me the angle of the D. She said, in her professional opinion, the signature on that letter was not consistent with authentic samples of my mother's handwriting. In her professional opinion, It showed characteristics consistent with a traced or carefully copied forgery. I sat in that office and I thought about Marcus taking me to that restaurant and ordering the chicken marsala and looking me in the eyes. The process that followed was not fast and it was not easy, and I am not going to pretend it was. There were depositions. There were lawyers' fees that I paid with a credit card and paid off slowly, month by month. There were phone calls from Marcus that I did not answer, and then a phone call from his wife, Amy, who did not know the full story and who cried and said she was so sorry and that she didn't understand any of it. And I believed her because Amy has always been decent, and I think she married someone she thought she understood. There was a moment, about 4 months into the legal process, when Marcus called me from what turned out to be a parking lot outside a Walgreens, and he cried, real tears from what I could tell. He said he'd made a terrible mistake. He said he'd been in debt at the time, real debt, the kind with consequences, and he'd panicked and he'd told himself he would pay me back, and then he never did. He said he was sorry. He said it over and over. I listened. I didn't say much. When he was quiet, I said, I know you're sorry, Marcus, but I need you to understand that sorry doesn't give me back 5 years. I hung up. The case was settled out of court 14 months after I walked into Patricia's office. The insurance company, facing significant liability for not properly authenticating the letter, agreed to reissue the $45,000 that was rightfully mine, with interest. Marcus, separately, agreed to a structured repayment plan to cover the additional damages, under terms I am not permitted to discuss in detail. What I can tell you is that he did not go to prison, which is something I made a deliberate choice about, for reasons I am still not entirely at peace with. What I can also tell you is that my Aunt Ruthann sat in that settlement meeting next to me, in a blazer she'd bought specifically for the occasion, and she didn't say a word the whole time. She just sat there with her white hair and her sharp eyes and her hand on my forearm when I needed it. She is the hero of this story. She is the one who asked questions when everyone else had moved on. She is the one who kept a photocopy in a folder in her filing cabinet for 2 years because something didn't sit right with her. She is 71 years old and she is the sharpest person I know. I want to talk about forgiveness, because people always ask about it and I think the question deserves a real answer. I do not hate my brother. I have thought about this carefully, and I genuinely do not. What I feel is more like the aftermath of something, like standing in a room where the furniture used to be. I know the shape of what was there. I can feel the absence. But I don't have the energy to be angry anymore, and I think somewhere along the way, anger just became grief, and grief became something quieter. Marcus and I do not have a relationship right now, not because I ended it violently or dramatically, but because when I imagined what it would look like to rebuild something with him, I couldn't picture it. I couldn't figure out what the foundation would be made of. You can forgive someone and still not know how to have dinner with them. Amy sends me a card every Christmas. I send one back. That feels like the right amount of contact for now. What I do have is Ruthann, who calls me every Sunday morning just to chat. She picked up a habit that my mother left behind and she carries it now without making a big deal of it, the way good people do things. I also have my business, which I started 2 years after the settlement, once I had enough capital and enough anger converted into determination. I have Biscuit, who is a 3-year-old shelter dog described on his intake form as needs patient owner, and who has been the best $30 I ever spent. And I have the thing I think my mother actually wanted to give me, which wasn't the money exactly, but what the money was supposed to represent, the knowledge that I could stand up for myself, the evidence that I was worth fighting for, the proof that the truth, even when it takes years, even when it costs more than it should, even when the person who wronged you cries real tears in a Walgreens parking lot, the truth eventually has weight. My mother was a school librarian for 30 years. She believed in the power of information. She believed that the right document, read carefully, could change everything. She was right about that. She was right about a lot of things. I think about her on Sunday mornings when Ruthann calls. I think about the daisy glasses and the coupon clippings, and the Honda and the 30 years of showing up. I think about how she saved carefully so she could give us something. She gave me something, just not the way either of us planned. And honestly, given everything, I think it was enough.